So I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker, who is our guest speaker for our two-part cybersecurity series. She's going to be covering part 2, which is on standardization and cybersecurity. But of course, she has a lot more to cover, and she's been kind enough to put some presentation points together for us today. Her name is Kirsten Kopsel. So Kirsten, if you'd like to join us with your video and audio, we'll go ahead and get started. Now, Kirsten put together a couple slides for us, so I'm just going to go ahead and advance the slides, and then I have a couple questions that I had for her. But certainly, as we're covering some of this material, feel free to also pose any questions. I'll make sure that we cover them before we move on to the next segment.
I should be back.
Did we lose her? There you are. Well, it wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't have technical difficulties, but welcome. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump right into kind of some of your slides. Let me know when you want to advance to the
Well,
next,
thank you, Angela,
topic.
for inviting me. I wanted to start with kind of my education, because I'm probably not the typical cybersecurity person, in that I'm not an IT person at all. I have taken software. I have taken classes where you had to write software. My degrees are actually in microbiology and metallurgical engineering, and I also have 2 law degrees. And in my second law degree, I took a course titled Cybercrime, which was actually, this was way back in 2003. And little did I know how it would actually lead to future work. It was an interesting class. The instructor really went out of his way to invite guest speakers. And actually, for our very first class, I'm not sure many of you will know the person we had, Captain Crunch, who was on the call, who years ago, Captain Crunch cereal had these little blue whistles that came in the cereal, and the guy, Captain Crunch, learned out how to manipulate the whistle in order to make free long-distance phone calls back on landlines at the time, which did not make like AT&T, who was the primary phone company at the time, very happy to have all these free calls being made. We also had a presentation from Kevin Mitnick, who sure some of you may know him. He's been involved in several incidents. I also update a book yearly on data security and privacy law. And my chapter is the very first one in the book. I update the statistics and types of hacking and viruses, as well as specific incidences where people have lost their data or companies have been hacked. And in a way, we've become quite cynical about the number of people that, I guess you'd say, have been data breached, because right now we do not include an incident in the book unless over 1 million people have been impacted. And there are a lot of incidents that happen every day with a lot less numbers, but we've had to go to that number. Otherwise, the book could just be nothing but a list of breaches for the previous year. Okay, Angela, next slide. So in 2005, I actually started attending meetings with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. They had a group called the Coalition Against Counterfeiting and Piracy. And we started looking at counterfeit materials, all the different kinds of counterfeit materials. And about 2 years after joining that, counterfeit electronics, particularly in like the aerospace and defense industry, became an issue. SAE stood up a committee, one of the G-19 committees on counterfeit electronics. AS 5553 was one of the first standards that was released for that under G-19. There are several other G-19 committees now. There's G-19C, which is compliance. I'm the chair of that one currently. We put together the verification standard for AS 5553C for companies to use. There's also G-19CI, which is continuous improvement of the AS 5553 standard, as well as an ARP related to 5553. There's G-19D, which is for independent distributors, persons who are possibly buying on the open market or overstock. There's also a testing committee, and then one for authorized distributors, who are the persons who buy directly from the companies that are making the Triple E parts. I'm also a member of the APMC, the Avionics Process Management Committee, G-21, which is looking at counterfeit material, which is material other than the Triple E parts, looking at fasteners, bearings, refrigerant. I recently joined G-25, which is Avionics and Electronics Corrosion Committee. And then finally, I'm a member of G-32, which was stood up just about a little over almost 2 years ago. And I'll talk more about that as later in the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I don't know how many of you watched the Mr. Robot TV series. I saw part of it, and I don't know, I couldn't get into it. So the one episode that I really did watch was, so Mr. Robot is a person who works, he's a hacker basically, and he becomes involved with a group that is trying to bring down a corporation. And the episode that I watched involved a person who I believe worked for the corporation. And this person came home from their run, and they go into their house, and they have everything electronically connected in the house. They can go in, turn on the music, they can control the heating and air conditioning, everything's through electronics. Well, when this person came back, they had already hacked the apartment. So when they walked into the house, music was blaring, and they could not control the music at all. So they went in to take a shower, which of course, the last thing you want to do is be in a shower where someone else is controlling the water temperature. And so they would control it very hot and very cold. So that's just one episode where a lot of things are connected. I saw something recently about a corporation whose HVA system was hacked, and they raised the temperature in the building such that it made it so hot that people had to evacuate, and they had to call in people to address the system. It turned out when they came back in, or it was suggested that theft of intellectual property had been stolen from the corporation while they were dealing with the HVAC system. And finally, for a real life situation that occurred a couple years ago, there was a ransom attack at the Bristol airport in England. And the airport decided they were not going to be paying what was requested. So instead, they took a lot of their systems offline in order to avoid the payment. And what they ended up having to do, because it included the data management system for their flight information, so they had to use whiteboards and pieces of paper where they basically wrote down what gates the passengers had to go to. It took them about 2 days to get back up online, but they decided they weren't going to pay, and they took all their systems offline. Okay, next slide, please. So if we start looking at it in terms of aviation, you could do this for almost any industry, is to really realize how it's connected. So I just started making a list of all the different aspects of aviation. So we have aircraft, but not only aircraft, we have the aircraft manufacturers, we have engine manufacturers, we have maintenance repair, we have airlines, we have airline maintenance, which includes caterers, cleaning, and refueling. We have airline personnel, which are basically pilots, navigators, flight attendants. We have passengers. Next slide. Then we also have to look at, we have airports and everything associated with airports, such as control towers, air traffic controllers. We have general aviation, which are the smaller aircraft that some companies may fly around in. They have aircraft, they have repair stations, they have all the personnel. We have air freight, which also has aircraft and repair stations. We have support equipment for aircraft and engines. We have the National Airspace System here in the US dealing with, now it's converting over to use of GPS satellites. We have radar systems, we have data communications, and we also have supply chains to all of that above. So if we think about aviation, but it's a huge ecosystem. It's not just it's not just the aircraft sitting over in one area. It's not airports sitting in another area. It's everything is connected. Next slide. So the one thing I want to really bring up, and sometimes we tend to forget this, is that all the aspects listed on the previous slides use information technology and information communication technology products. That includes computers, tablets, mobile devices, hardware, and software. So what happens is everything is in a way connected. So when it impacts one area, it could impact other areas. But we can look at this as not just an issue for aviation, but other industries such as automotive. Next slide. So, but if we go back and we think about all the list of the, we have the aircraft, the engines, the airports. If we think about all of those, many people might think that they're all operating their own cybersecurity systems, which in a way they probably really are. But they're all in a way really connected, particularly with the supply chain to areas. And so, but they don't stand apart as each of them relies on another. So I want to emphasize that the system is much more than what you can see and touch. It's not that you can just see the computers within, say, the aircraft or airport or the manufacturing. But you have other computer systems, cyber security systems that are touching on your system. All right, next slide. So then I thought to start thinking about, well, what if all of those, from aircraft to airlines to National Airspace System, implemented their own standard for cybersecurity? Well, that could really be a mess, because how are people going to be connected? It was like several years ago, several of us went and were talking with the one of the government agencies, and we were trying to explain to them what standards were. And I ended up with this example saying, what if all the cell phone companies had developed their own standards for their phone? So if you had an AT&T phone or Nokia phone, and your neighbors or your business had an Ericsson phone, and each of those had their own standards, would that mean that you'd have to buy all those different phones in order to communicate with persons? So that was basically trying to say, we develop standards. And so the thing is like, we have to consider that cybersecurity probably will need the same. So then you have to say, if all these systems have different standards, would they still be able to connect? And another question is, do all of them have the same concerns regarding cybersecurity? Does everybody take patching the system the same way? We still hear about companies that haven't patched their systems like they should have. Is everyone vetting the employees that are accessing it? With remote working, that's a huge question as to how are people protecting their computers at home when they're accessing work computers. All right, next slide. So about September 2018, regarding G-32, there was a kickoff meeting to discuss cyber physical systems security. This was a very interesting meeting because we had a lot of different people coming together to speak about this as an issue. One of the examples presented in the meeting for like persons that are working with electronic vehicles to think about is that the charging stations may not necessarily be in areas that, say, a lot of people are constantly around. Say if you were driving out in Utah or Montana or Idaho or New Mexico, Arizona, those charging stations may be few and far apart. And who is maintaining those stations? Who has access to those stations? So if you had an electronic vehicle and you needed to charge it for some reason, regardless, or even if you're going to the local hotel, I mean, a lot of local, hotels have started putting electronic charging stations in, but who's monitoring those? How are you preventing persons from uploading malware onto the system, which you now have in your automobile, and maybe it's malware that can be used to control your automobile. So we talked about all sorts of issues with regards to cybersecurity. And then in February of 2019, G-32 had its first meeting where we looked at the charter and the committee structure. Here's a list of all the different kinds of areas of concern that G-32 is looking at in terms of electronic and physical security. You have information assurance and data, software assurance and application security, asset management and asset control, anti-counterfeit and supply chain risk management, life cycle and diminishing manufacturing sources and material shortages, anti-malicious and anti-tamper, track and trace, prognostics, forensics and recovery plans, and information sharing and reporting. All of these are important when it comes to cybersecurity, and it's possible that we're not always thinking about these systems when we're looking at an item. All right, next slide, please. So under G-32, we have 3 standards that are currently being developed. One looking at software assurance, one looking at hardware assurance, and one that it's developing the cyber physical system security engineering plan. It is considering the domains that I listed previously. The standard is looking at all those, asking that companies have to address it. The standard is requiring a company to develop and implement a risk-based cyber physical system security engineering plan, which includes the domains of consideration, looking at life cycle management process, as well as risk-related issues. So I think that's about all I need to add at this point. If you have any questions, Angela?
Yeah, actually, and due to time, I'm not going to ask all my questions. Of course, I had lots of questions for you. I love everything that you covered today because there were aspects that, of course, I'm not an engineer, but I didn't even think about things like charging stations and routes like that. So I appreciate you pointing out these different scenarios and examples. I do have one question. I shared out the action button if anybody wants to take a look at that specific committee and look at the works in progress, the standards that they're currently working on. But the question I have for you is, can you tell me what inspired you to join this committee and what do you enjoy most about participating?
I think part of it is based from like G19 participation is that sometimes when standards are being written, we may forget that there are organizations that may be required to implement the standard and that they don't always have the personnel who have the same background and training as the persons who develop the standard. So for instance, when I participate on the software assurance committee, and I'm constantly bringing up, and other people on the committee is starting to bring it up too, is like, how is a company, say a much smaller company, say they only have 10 people, but they're having to provide software. Well, they may not even know that much about cybersecurity. And I think there are a lot of companies at times that may think, well, cybersecurity, that's just a problem or an issue for larger companies. I'm not going to have that problem. So I think that's part of the reason. And I like to see how other people are developing the standard. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in cyber. And you also have to remember that you have to be able to translate it into a standard that can be used by organizations of all different sizes, and that there may be international companies that are wanting to use it also. So you need to write it in a method or a manner in which they'd be able to implement it.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much for that description. I think it's important for us to understand, not only why are the standards important, but why the developmental process is important as well. Well, we are getting kind of close to time, so I'm not gonna, and I actually think a lot of the questions I had you already covered in all of your slides, so I do appreciate that. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if we start to move forward, I did want to touch on your professional development course. If anyone is curious about learning more from Kirsten Kopsel, she is one of our trainers for PD. And when we get into Kelly McCann's segment, she's going to highlight that course in particular and how you can gain access to it. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, Kirsten. I really appreciate all of your time
Thank
and your
you,
volunteer
Angela.
efforts in the standardization practices. Thank you.